Hello and welcome to So Hear Me Out, a podcast from London's Southbank Centre about classical music and the big questions it can help us explore.
I'm Linton Stevens, musician, broadcaster and illustrator.
And I'm Gillian Moore, broadcaster, writer and artistic associate here at Southbank Centre.
Each episode begins with a question, something that opens the door into the music and how we hear it today.
Sometimes it's a piece that everyone knows, and sometimes it's a work that's been long overlooked, but always music that still has something to say to us now.
And if we need to explain something musically, well, we've got a piano in the room, and Gillian, you're ready to jump in, aren't you?
Yep, because this isn't just about what music meant in the past when it was written, but about what it still means now, about how it can speak to power, provoke thought, or push for change.
And today's question is a powerful one. It's, how is classical music protest music?
We're used to thinking of protest in terms of chants and banners and speeches, but what happens when rebellion lives inside the music itself?
I've got a piece of music that's radical in both sound and spirit. Minimalist, yes, but pulsing with defiance. A work by a composer who used his voice, identity and music to confront systems that tried to silence him. It's Julius Eastman's Gay Guerrilla.
And I'll be bringing a piece that turns a revolutionary Chilean folk song into a 45-minute marathon of resistance. It transforms simple variations into something relentless and beautiful and politically powerful. It's Frederic Rzewski's The People United Will Never Be Defeated.
These are pieces that don't just reflect protest, they are protest. And they still hit with force.
So whether you're deep into classical music or just curious about what music can still do,
join us as we delve into some great music together. This is episode 3.
Rhythms of Revolution. How is classical music protest music? So, Linton, what have you been up to this week and where did this question come from?
Okay, so this is quite obscure, but stick with me here. So we were watching a couple of films this week, my boyfriend and I, and we saw Anne Hathaway in Batman and also in Les Mis, and I was actually just saying how good an actress she is, having watched her in those two films. But then I was listening to the music in Les Mis, and in particular one piece called Do You Hear the People Sing? And it got me thinking about how music is protest music. I mean, listen to these lyrics. Will you join in our crusade? Who will be strong and stand with me beyond the barricade? Is there a world you long to see? Then join in the fight that will give you the right to be free.
It's so stirring, isn't it? I mean, you just can't help but be sort of converted to the cause when you're listening to that music. And I guess in the history of classical music, there is so much music that has that kind of thing about protest behind it. You know,
but in so many different ways as well. I mean, just a couple of examples. Anything by Shostakovich, while he was writing under the rule of the Soviet Union, you know, he used to weave all sorts of things in.
It was all kind of a bit secret and under the surface, wasn't it? But
slightly
he somehow
rebellious.
Got it in. Yeah, exactly.
Or, for example, the chorus of the Hebrew Slaves from Verdi's opera Nabucco, which is in itself a kind of call to action, but also that actually premiered under an occupied Italy. So people kind of think that was perhaps in and of itself a wider call to arms, call to action.
And that became an anthem, sort of popular anthem
absolutely.
At the time.
Or another one is William Grant Still's Oratorio, and They Lynched Him on a Tree, which is scored for orchestra and choirs. 2 choirs, actually. A white choir that represents an angry mob and a black choir that portrays the victims' mourners. So that, again, is a way of protesting racism in and of itself, but in a completely different way.
So what's the piece that you've brought for us to look at today?
So I've chose a composer and an artist and a piece that I really resonate with. I've picked Julius Eastman and his work for 2 pianos called Gay Guerrilla. So Julius Eastman was born in 1940 and he died at the age of 50 in 1990. He was an American composer, pianist and vocalist known for his boundary-pushing minimalist music and unapologetic embrace of his black and queer identity. His work, Gay Guerrilla, is a powerful piece for multiple pianos where Eastman reclaims the term guerrilla as a symbol of queer resistance. The composition layers kind of dense, pulsating piano textures, gradually building intensity, reflecting both the struggle and solidarity. Eastman saw the piece as a tribute to those who fought for freedom, whether across the board in the LGBTQ plus community or in a broader struggle for justice, making it a profound statement of, for me, identity, defiance, and resilience. So Gillian, let's get into this piece then. Let's hear a little bit of Julius Eastman's Gay Guerrilla. That was an extract from Gay Guerrilla by Julius Eastman. It was arranged by Jace Clayton and performed by Clayton, Emily Manzo and David Friend from the 2013 release Clayton, the Julius Eastman Memory Depot, out now on the New Amsterdam label. So just a little snippet there. What are your first impressions of it?
Well, it's very gentle, at the moment, at least in the music, the bit you've just played. For protest music, it's very much for me in that world of the music that was going around in New York at the time. It's when Steve Reich was writing. It's when Philip Glass was writing it. This sort of quite gentle, repetitive, minimalist music, often on pianos. I'm just kind of wondering where the music's going to go in terms of its sense of anger and protest, because at the moment it doesn't sound very guerrilla-like to me.
Well, I think that's what's really interesting about this piece, because for me, it starts gentle and there's so much that we can dig into about the kind of techniques that he used, and I'll talk a bit about them later. But like protest, I think very often protests start quite peaceful. And it's usually, we think of the two examples we gave, Stonewall and the civil rights movement. They end in something bigger and very often more violent. And I think that's what this piece does as well. So what we can hear here is many more layers, and what Julius Eastman tried to do is he would start with something very, very simple and let the musician take control of how the piece evolves, always involving what had come before. And I think that's kind of like protest as well. It starts with the unrest of a few who gather and gain momentum, and then it ends in something bigger and huger. But I also think that protest and the idea of protest was at the very crux of what Julius Eastman did as an artist as well.
Well, from what I know about, the titles of his pieces, I mean, they're really some of the other pieces. Gay Guerrilla is a strong enough title in itself, but, some of the other ones are even stronger. He came from a religious background. We have a lot of quite religious titles that kind of subvert the idea of organized religion. He grew up in church choirs, and that was his musical training. But I think, song pieces like, there was one piece that he played when he just first arrived in New York called Praise God from Whom All Devils Grow, which is, of course, a sort of biting satire on that doxology hymn that anybody who's grown up in a church would know, praise God from whom all blessings flow. And I think there were even more strong titles later on.
Yeah, and I think it's a huge embodiment of him as an artist. I mean, he was a black man post-civil rights movement, working in a Eurocentric art form, where especially at that time, what we're seeing is mostly celebrated works by European white males. So for him to be himself a black queer male working in classical music, an extremely talented black queer male working in classical music, he was a prodigy as a pianist as a child.
And also a singer. He was singing opera at the time he was writing this music. He was singing, this is all happening downtown in New York, but he was uptown with Pierre Boulez and Zubin Mehta, these great conductors.
Rubbing shoulders with the finest, wasn't he?
Exactly, and singing a lot of roles. He recorded Peter Maxwell Davis's really experimental out there piece, 8 Songs for a Mad King, with Pierre Boulez, who was at the time the conductor of the New York Philharmonic. He had all that credibility in that white musical Eurocentric world, but at the same time he's downtown writing Gay Guerrilla and this other kind of very political music, which is so much himself, his own identity.
It's a big pushback, I think, and I think for him to wear these elements of himself as a composer, I think it was an incredibly brave thing that he did as a queer black composer in that world. His career, as you mentioned, began at the Curtis Institute, where he studied piano and singing.
And the Curtis is one of the most elite classical music institutions in America, in the world, really.
Yeah, still today, still 50 years later. And in those years that followed when he graduated, that's, as you said, when he started to kind of explore this world of experimental music. And I think it was a very bold statement for him to make, to wear those portions of his identity and put those portions of his identity into his music and use them as titles. And funnily enough, I find this fascinating. There was so much pushback on the titles that he used, to the point that actually he was doing recitals in a university, I think in Buffalo, and there was a protest about them. There was a protest about the titles of these pieces, and he had to give a speech and explain why he's using these kind of inflammatory titles. I think even today people would be perturbed about the titles that he uses, but I think there's a real sense of reclamation in taking those titles and using them and putting them out and putting them through his art.
So he uses the N-word in some of his titles.
Yeah, in quite a lot. In a big series of his pieces, he uses the N-word in different contexts. But he said about this, he said, now the reason I use that particular word is because for me, it has what I called a basicness about it. That is to say, I feel that in any case, the first N-words were, of course, the field N-words. Upon that is really the basis of the American economic system. So without these field N-words, you wouldn't really have such a great and grand economy that we have today. So that is what I call the first and great N-word. And what I mean by using that word is that thing that is fundamental, that person or thing that attains to a basicness, a fundamentalness that eschews that thing which is superficial and what we can say in this context is elegant. So I think he's saying, look, this is what you use as a jibe or to put me down, and actually I can take it and I can add it to music and I can give it a certain elegance and I can elevate it and I can own it and I can say that has no power over me anymore. And I think that's an incredibly political and bold statement.
Well, it's what hip-hop artists, I guess, have done as well later on, isn't it?
And I think the other thing about Eastman as well is I also think in the way that he wrote, the way that he approached writing music was itself a protest. I've played, as a bassoonist, I've played a few bits of Eastman. It's come up every now and then. And the beauty of it is he gives so much creative choice to the player.
Yeah.
So he will write these kind of small cells of music, and it's up to the player to then choose how that music evolves. And it's kind of very loosely structured. He'll say, here's the first phrase, and play around with it, change octaves, change dynamics, and then here's the second phrase, but you choose when you want to move on to that second phrase.
It's very open music. It invites people in, and that in itself is quite a political act. And that was very much something that was happening at that time as well, with a number of composers who'd write these open pieces that could involve any instrumentation. It didn't say we've got to have 6 violins and 3 bassoons in this piece. It could be any instrumentation that was available.
Which, of course, actually, instrumentation is quite a modern thing. Pre-Baroque, music was kind of written very freely for any instrumentation, any combination of instruments that happened to be around. So whilst it feels radical, it's actually kind of a pretty old concept. But I think the other thing, as you mentioned earlier as well, he was among one of the first composers to combine these processes of this idea of minimalist music, small cells of music. And then he also found other ways of modifying and extending that music in a quite experimental way. And he coined this phrase, so this combination of these two things, experimental and minimalist, he coined this phrase, organic music, which I think is, as a musician, it's a hugely satisfying thing, because very often as musicians, we interpret somebody else's notes, where Julius Eastman was giving the musicians the agency to be creative. He was giving us the foundations on which to build something that was entirely unique. And that's really important in the recording that I've chose of Gay Guerrilla. Because I love how the artists in this, Emily Manzo and David Friend, really evolve the music. So it starts very simply. And I found it, because the great thing is there's so many recordings of these pieces out there. And the beautiful thing is that you will never hear 2 recordings the same, either in length or in how they develop. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. You listen to, say, Beethoven 7, and you're going to have very close interpretations every single time, and if somebody decides to go a little bit slower than it is usually done, or faster, that it's considered radical. But in this situation, a radically different recording could be the difference between 10 minutes, a 10-minute recording, and a 25-minute recording, and an hour-long recording, So I think that's a really beautiful thing, to give the musicians the agency to be creative. And I think that in itself is a protest. It's a protest against what's normally done, having a fully scored, fully notated piece of music. Here he is again, not only putting his identity into this piece of music, but also pushing back and saying, musicians, you can do this how you want.
And again, it's important to say that, if he'd wanted to go down the sort of fully written out, very sort of tightly structured musical route, he absolutely had the skills and the tools to do that, because he had all this rigorous training and he was working in that field some of the time as well. But he chose, for his own music, for his own identity, to embody this freedom, which was, again, in the air at the time. And in the 1970s, there was a lot of free jazz going on in New York at the time, for example, and those musicians, those artists were all meeting each other, mingling. Must have been an exciting time.
I mean, I think it's maybe one of those that we look back on and with rose-tinted glasses and think, maybe. Oh, that must have been, it must have been amazing. All of this amazing art was being produced in that time, including the stuff that Julius Eastman was creating. But I also think it's really worth remembering that whilst he kind of moved into this space of being creative, he also died not successful, not being very well known. Now, I think his mental health and possibly drug usage and a very possible HIV status was to do with all of that. But I think that plays into it, the rejection that, this is before the AIDS crisis in the 80s, but that rejection he must have felt from his peers, from audiences. Very often, it's not uncommon that we see artists die not being successful, because and we so often hear this phrase, oh, he was ahead of his time. And I think in many ways he was. Like, there was an appreciation for what he did, but we can see exactly what he was doing that was actually then, and even still today, revolutionary. If we think about that piece of music that we've listened to as well, Gay Guerrilla, the way that it starts quietly, in the same way that, discord might start within a community with 1 or 2 people getting together, and the snowballing of collective action that then ends in sometimes something quite violent, but usually massed people. I think that's really reflected in this piece, this idea of protest, and how within a community that comes about. And it was I mean, whether he meant to do that or not, I don't know. But I just think it was really clever. And then giving all of his pieces these titles that are quite incendiary as well, which make you look and, seeing what the students at this university did in protest. It's getting people together, and that is the main aim of protest, isn't it? It's collective action. Gay Guerrilla by Julius Eastman, arranged by Jace Clayton and performed by Clayton and pianists Emily Manzo and David Friend.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think, as you say, the title is so provocative. Gay Guerrilla is so provocative, and at the time it would have been even more provocative. But I think the way it builds and the idea of people coming together. I mean, a moment in the piece that I think really shows that for me is, quite far into it when everything's built up. We started in this very quiet, gentle way, and then the music gets more and more and more, well, just louder and more clamorous generally, and the sound gets fuller and you get the sense that there's more people. And then at this sort of climactic moment, you hear blazing out this great hymn, which is actually a Lutheran chorale written by Martin Luther, that great reformer of the church who got rid of Latin and really tried to make religion something that ordinary people could really focus in on. That's a big symbol at that moment. It's called Ein feste Burg, our safe stronghold.
Just so happens we've got a piano with us, Gillian. I wonder if you can give us a little blast of that and we can hear them side by side to hear how I think this proves the genius in and the talent of Julius Eastman as a composer to be able to quote from the likes of Martin Luther and weave it into this brand new way of working.
Yeah, so this is this Martin Luther hymn as arranged, as he did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Lutheran hymns by Johann Sebastian Bach.
Let's hear it how Julius Eastman used it. Let's hear how Julius Eastman worked that into his piece. So even that in itself is a kind of a form of, I'm going to take something very reverent and make it a little bit irreverent. I'm going to put it into this piece of protest music. I'm going to take it out of one context and put it into another. And I just think everything about how Julius Eastman worked, whether he realized it or not, was just a small protest, whether it was to the system or to the way people are seen and, being LGBTQ, being gay back then was still illegal. All of these things were just clever ways of saying, I am a composer, I am a black person, I'm a queer person, and I belong here, and I'm going to own my space through my art form. And that's one form of protest. I think I said that, protest can be quiet, and this is quiet, but inbuilt in so much of what Julius Eastman did. Rzewski, on the other hand, the piece that you've chosen, he does it in a very different way, actually closer to the piece that inspired me, the Can You Hear the People Sing, which was a direct call to action. Rzewski does it in a very similar way to that, doesn't he?
It's funny, isn't it, Linton? We each decided that we were going to bring a different piece which somehow illustrated this idea about can classical music be protest music. And we did have the whole of the history of classical music to choose from. But both of us ended up in New York in the mid-1970s, funnily enough, with two composers who actually knew each other. And a bit like the music of Julius Eastman, this is a piece that has grown and grown in its reputation. When I heard it in the 80s in North London at an experimental music festival, it was very much a minority pursuit. But now there are lots of recordings of it, and it's been taken on by some of the sort of greatest and best and most virtuosic solo pianists.
So tell me a little bit about Rzewski.
He was a composer who lived roughly, he was born in the 1930s and he died only a couple of years ago, I think in 2022, an American composer. He was a great intellectual. He was a highly political artist. And as I said, he was a brilliant pianist. I have a personal memory of when I was a student at York University, he came to visit and we were all a bit dazzled by him. And we were playing a piece of his, which, like much of Julius Eastman's music, was actually, just a line of music that you could play with any amount of instruments. It was very free and open score. I had the bad luck to be on the piano and he was looking over my shoulder as, a truly brilliant pianist that he was.
There is nothing more terrifying than that, is there?
I know. And I was playing it in this sort of simple line. It was a simple tune that we all had to play sort of in our own time. And I was just playing it as one line and he was going, this should be played in double octaves and it should be played at 3 times the speed you're doing it. And so I have got a personal memory of Frederic Rzewski from that point of view as well. But he was writing music that was highly political. And actually the connection between him and Julius Eastman is that they were in a kind of experimental music group in Buffalo, New York, upstate New York. And at one point in the mid-70s, there was a riot in the Attica prison. And I think 40 people were killed and it became a real political cause célèbre. And Rzewski and Julius Eastman actually went into Attica and Eastman performed a piece of Rzewski's and they performed together a number of times.
So it's unsurprising that we've both picked these pieces about protest because that was a real time of unrest in America, wasn't it? So what was the piece that you've picked, Gillian?
So I've picked a piece called The People United Will Never Be Defeated, and it's for solo piano. It's about an hour long. It's a set of 36 variations on a political song. And what I find really exciting about it is that when this was written, it was a hot political topic. It was a piece that the political song had been written in Chile just 2 years before Frederic Rzewski wrote this set of variations on it. It's called in Spanish, El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido. And it came out of the Chilean coup where General Pinochet deposed the democratically elected president of Chile, Salvatore Allende. It was a bloodbath and it became a very important political cause all around the world.
El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido. El pueblo unido jamás será vencido.
That was El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido, performed by Quilapayún, taken from the album of the same name, released in 1990 via the MLP label. So the melody sounds like a traditional melody, but it was actually written directly as a result of the coup in 1973 by a group of musicians, Chilean musicians who specialised in traditional music. It's a fantastically simple tune. And then Rzewski makes this set of what we call variations, which is a very, very classical form. Bach wrote 32 Goldberg variations. Beethoven wrote the so-called Diabelli variations. It was a really kind of classical thing to do. And Rzewski's chosen this classical form to take this radical political song and make something, make an amazing work of art out of it. Let's hear how Frederic Rzewski lays out the original song at the beginning of this long set of variations. People United Will Never Be Defeated by Frederic Rzewski, performed by Igor Levit, taken from the album The People United Will Never Be Defeated, 36 Variations, which was released in 2016 via Sony Music Entertainment.
Do you know what I love about this, Gillian? You couldn't deny that this is a protest song because the original begins with a call to action. It's not musical, it's rhythmic. Da 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 ba 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 ba. That's the first thing we learn as musicians is rhythm before we kind of explore melody. We get beat and then we get rhythm. And so you take this rhythmic call to arms, call to action, and then you turn it into music. And then you hear how Rzewski does that. He adds melody, but it's quite a fanfare.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's like that beginning when he actually thumps it out on the piano is quite, it is a call to arms. It's like,
And that's the thing that pulls you in before you get into anything harmonic, or it's just this octave, and octaves as well, playing octaves, the same note but higher and lower, is a great way to make a statement, I think.
And if we want to get kind of musically nerdy about why this is a really good tune to build a set of variations on, one of the things is just that it's quite simple. So at the beginning, you've got this kind of tune, very sort of, based on a simple chordal, triadic, what we would say, pattern. And then the bass is just sort of going down. Listen to this. It's so very simple. And in the middle section, you've got a really clear harmonic thing, which we call a cycle of fifths, which is, you'll recognize
but really recognizable.
Really
I think
recognizable,
that's the important thing.
yeah. I'll just try and just do that for you.
So you get your yum, bum, bum, bum,
Exactly.
bum.
And then you go back to a simple 3-part thing. So that spine is with you all the way through. It's like an essence that goes through the piece for a whole hour. And at different parts, it's recognizable in the different ways.
I was going to say, I'd love to hear an example of a variation. So we've talked about, this is our starting point, our theme.
Yeah.
How does he change it?
Well, it goes through really also, because Rzewski, like Julius Eastman, was such a well-educated and fluent musician. So he was able to range across like the whole history of music. And one of the early variations kind of, I think, acknowledges the fact that we are in the mid-20th century and there's a bit of kind of a spiky modernism. So after the initial statement of the theme, it's kind of shattered into tiny fragments right across the piano keyboard in a sort of pointillistic, if you take an analogy from painting, version. And it brings to mind for me the kind of European avant-garde, but you can still really hear the essence of the tune there.
Do you know what's amazing about that? The melody is still there, it's still completely recognizable, but you can hear him going up and down the keyboard. You can hear this thing starting to fragment.
Yeah.
So clever.
It's making me smile.
And yet it's still very coherent.
Yeah.
It's still very much...
Completely.
It's still unmistakably that melody.
So if we move on, just to show the range of the style, we move on to, I think it's variation 13, variation 13, where it's played in a blues style. Let's hear that.
And you've still got all these elements that we talked about, that descending bass
Yeah.
It's the harmony that changes, which changes the context of it, doesn't it?
And then what you call the inflection, like the way you sort of bend the notes. Of course, you can't bend the notes in the piano, but the way a good pianist can do it with adding little extra grace notes makes it sound like you might be playing it you might be singing it. And Ella Fitzgerald might be singing it, or you might be playing it on a saxophone.
It's a gorgeous piece.
But the styles of this music goes way beyond jazz and way beyond contemporary music. Rzewski, as I said, was an amazing pianist. He could play all these kind of 19th century, very flashy piano showpieces. And some of the writing for the piano makes me think of, for example, Franz Liszt, who was the kind of rock star of 19th century classical music, who'd go around Europe just dazzling people with his extremely virtuosic, flashy piano music. And there's quite a lot of that. So if we listen to Variation 20, let's hear that.
Again, you can still hear the core of it, can't you? But you can hear him moving further and further away stylistically.
It's crazy,
and
isn't
technically,
it?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's very Liszt, isn't it? The big...
Yep. Octaves in the right,
Yeah.
and flashy stuff going all over the piano. I mean, I suppose I have a question about what is this kind of 19th century romantic hero type music doing in 1970s highly political New York music? Maybe what's interesting is that the tune, as you say, is still recognizable, but it's just they're constantly reminding us all the time of its message that, political oppression, that dictators will never win. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that, but I also think it demonstrates the history of the art form. The history of everything is built on something that came before. And I think it's a testament to that, isn't it? It's a nod to all the people that developed piano and piano technique that came before Rzewski. It's a nod to that. And it's to say that this piece, this music, this cause is built on something that came before. We often hear people who are kind of leaders of resistance say, I do this so that the generations afterwards won't have to. And it's a kind of similar thing. I think it's a nod to, I do this so that you can do more.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because right towards the end of the piece, just before we get the tune coming back and everything, we do hear snatches of other political songs from struggles from the past. And I recognised Bertolt Brecht and Hans Eisler's Solidarity song, for example, coming in. It kind of blares out in defiant resistance towards the end of the piece. Da-da-da-dum-bum.
What's the banging we can hear, Gillian?
I think he's banging the piano lid down.
Right.
And that's one of the things that the musician is instructed to do, also at different points.
Do you know why I think that's absolutely brilliant? Because it reminds us that it's a person who's making this music.
Yeah.
Especially as a musician, we're so often taught to display perfection in our performance, that to the point that we want the audience to just hear the music being made by the instrument. And I love that he's instructed the pianist to bang the piano and to whistle, because it reminds us that it is a human making the music, which also I think in turn reminds us that these protest pieces of music are human causes.
Yes, and that thing about the human, I think the very fact that this piece is so hard to play, such a mountain to climb as a musician, really for me emphasizes that human thing. Also the very difficulty of it, the technical difficulty of it, I think in a way has ensured its life, because it is a piece that I'd say increasingly, there are lots of recordings coming out of this work. I think some of the best, that recording is Igor Levit, who is just, one of the most successful pianists alive on the planet. He's also one of the most adventurous, as it happens. But he has taken it on, and a number of other pianists have taken it on who could be doing anything. They could just be having an easy life. They could just be recording Chopin and Liszt, but they choose to play this because it's so rewarding, and it's such an amazing listen for the audience as well.
It's interesting how those small changes in variations can keep a listener interested for a whole hour. I've got to say, that was a piece that I wasn't massively familiar with before, so thanks so much for bringing that one to me, Gillian.
We've looked at two composers using music for activism, one through personal identity and the other through solidarity with a cause. But at their core, both pieces give voice to people who've been silenced.
These pieces do more than just tell stories from the past. Pinochet's coup, the Stonewall riots, they connect to struggles that we're still facing today.
So did this music make a difference? Does it still? At the time, artists, composers, writers and activists were all trying to use their work to challenge injustice and inspire change.
Art has always had the power to amplify stories, to spark courage and to keep the fight for justice alive.
Whether it's Eastman's raw, unapologetic defiance or Rzewski's sweeping anthem of unity,
music can carry a message, move hearts and maybe even change the world. Thanks for listening.
So, Hear Me Out is brought to you by the wonderful people at the Southbank Centre.
And produced by the brilliant team at Reduced Listening.
Thanks for spending time with us. If you liked this episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe share it with a friend.
We love exploring big ideas through music, and we've got plenty more to come.
So join us next time for another adventure. Until then, keep listening, keep questioning.
And keep letting music surprise you. See you next time.